Hello, green-minded teachers. Welcome to episode 5 of the School Gardens with Ease podcast. I'm your host, Leila Mireskandari. And in this part 2 episode on the topic of school gardens summer maintenance, we're going to talk about watering chore. So if you haven't listened to episode 4, I encourage you to go ahead and do that because we talked about how to eliminate all summer chores. The only one we didn't talk about, which we will talk about in this episode, was watering. So we talked about how to proactively build a garden that needs no weeding, no harvesting, no cleaning up during summertime, no fertilizing, and also build a garden that's resilient to pest and disease so you don't have any chores related to managing pest and disease during summer. Now, watering was the only one we didn't talk about because that's the only one that is really difficult to completely eliminate, but we can reduce it by 80%. So let's talk about that. We all know that annual vegetable gardens need water, but some of us might not know how crucial generous and consistent watering is for an annual vegetable garden. I quickly mentioned it when I talked about, growing strong plants in your garden that are resilient to, pests and disease. But that quick mention doesn't do justice. So let's talk about this. When plants get stressed under drought and then all of a sudden are overwatered and they stressed again and then overwatered a few times of that, and they are really weak and they won't grow very well. Newly sowed seeds are even more sensitive to this because, you wake them up when you plant them and you water them, and then if you give them drought, they die right away. So this happens a lot, that a garden is built and the seeds are sown and teachers are so proud of what they've accomplished so far, they start focusing on other needs of their students and they leave the garden and they forget to water it every day. And then they wonder why nothing happened, nothing grew. And contrary to what you might think, in those cases, I don't blame the teachers for forgetting to water or for getting busy. Teachers are the busiest people on the planet, in my opinion. You have to be, your vegetable garden should not be another source of stress for you, another heavy burden on your shoulders, another thing to feel guilty about. The problem isn't that you get busy and you forget. The problem is the design of your garden. Same thing happens when teachers start seedlings indoors in, paper or clay pots. These types of pots placed under the sun, which is where you should be placing your seedlings, dry up so quickly that they require watering twice a day. And if you get a drier classroom environment, you sometimes need to water them 3 times a day. Who has time for all that? Who needs that type of, stress added to their day? The problem here also is not that you get busy and you don't want to do extra hard work. The problem is the design here too. So when it comes to watering during summer, though, the issue is even bigger because some of us get really, really dry summers and no amount of volunteers would be enough to water the garden 2 or 3 times a day, 7 days a week. So let's get proactive and reduce the need for watering as much as possible. So number 1, if your garden is in containers or raised beds, choose the right container or raised bed. I'm an environmentalist. I hate plastic. Just like any other environmentalist, I love the romantic idea of cloth planters and coconut coir baskets and clay pots and paper pots, etc. Would have loved it if those worked, but they don't. Not for school gardens, they don't. I mean, they might work for my little kitchen garden in my windowsill, and that's only if I don't go for a vacation during summer that's more than a week, but they are a disaster for school gardens. So for smaller size planter gardens, I'm sorry to say, go with plastic pots and containers because they keep moisture inside much, much better than any other type of planter. For bigger containers, famously called troughs, I would still opt in for plastic. Have you seen those metal troughs? I don't know how on earth those got so popular. Metal gets burning hot during summer. Soil cooks to crisp in those troughs. They need twice the amount of watering. So if you've been offered those, and I know some school boards that promote those, unfortunately, run the other way with all your power. And if you've already gotten them, I don't know, cover them or something and put in place every other tip and technique that I tell you in this episode because you're already at a disadvantage. When it comes to raised beds, wooden raised beds are recommended, even though you don't need any container or raised beds to contain and define your garden really, because gardens can be built without borders, and all you need to do to define them is build pathways. That's a little bit more advanced and deserves its series of episodes. Maybe one day we talk about that. But just want to quickly mention that you don't really need raised beds. But if you are to go with raised beds, go with wood. And if you want to have on the ground shorter garden types, you can even, define your garden with big stones. Well, not little stones that your, students can pick up and throw at each other and play with. Bigger stones that that are heavy and they can't just pick up. So that's number one. Choose the right container for your plants. Number two, have no bare exposed soil. The easiest way to significantly and quickly lose water, and therefore have a huge watering issue, is to leave soil surfaces exposed to sunlight and wind. Not only water doesn't stay in the soil, it evaporates very quickly. In very hot and dry days, when you water the garden, the water that's on the surface of the soil evaporates before it has the chance to actually seep into the soil and get your garden deeply watered. You want every square inch of your soil surface to be completely covered. There are 3 ways that you can cover your soil. One is by artificial covers like plastic. Number 2 is natural mulch. And number 3 is living mulch, also called ground cover plants. Okay. I'll start with my favorite method, which is living mulch. When it comes to spacing your plants, I really think plant spacing is overrated. If you have good quality rich soil to start with, which is what I always recommend you do, don't go after cheap soil. You can plant much denser than most do or recommend. I also think that plant spacing is misunderstood. If they say that tomato needs 1 square foot to grow well, that means you can't grow 3 tomato plants in 1 square foot and expect good results. But that doesn't mean that you can't sprinkle leaf lettuce and arugula and herbs around the base of your tomato plant. You certainly can, because not only those plants' root depth and nutritional needs are different than your tomatoes, they won't get into competition. They will add to soil and also garden biodiversity, and they will cover the soil surface. And of course, more food and much more beautiful gardens. So go ahead and give that a try. I promise you'll see a huge difference in the amount of watering that you need to do. The second way to cover the soil is by natural mulch. Examples of natural mulch are leaf mulch, wood chips, pebbles, and straw. Straw mulch is the only one that I recommend for an annual vegetable garden. Stones are not very good because they store heat during the day and then they release it at nighttime. And even though it's okay to have stones, like big stones to define your garden, like around your garden, but covering the entire surface of the soil with stones, it probably is not a good idea. They are also very heavy and hard to move around and work with. And especially if you don't like them and you want to remove them, they're very difficult to remove. Leaf and wood mulch decompose relatively fast, and during the process of decomposition, they steal nitrogen from your soil, which is what your annual vegetable gardens, especially your heavy eaters like tomatoes and cucumbers and eggplants and things like that, desperately need. Those types of mulches are very good for perennial gardens and, trees and perennial shrubs and things like that, but not for annual vegetable gardens. For annual vegetable gardens, I recommend straw. But make sure that you are using straw and not hay, because hay contains seeds and it's not a good mulch because it creates a weeding issue for you. And the third type that you can cover your soil surface is by artificial covers such as plastic. I really dislike those types. As an environmentalist, I really don't recommend you do that because they tear and then you have to throw them out and replace them and stuff like that. And, you're adding to the plastic problem of this world by doing that. But if you didn't find straw, or for whatever the reason you didn't do living mulch, which I really won't understand why you wouldn't do that, then it's better than leaving the soil bare and exposed probably. But remember, you don't want to block rain from reaching your soil. So plastic covers work only for sub-irrigated or self-watering planters, which I'm going to talk about soon. So it's really not the best option for you anyway. So it's best to cover your garden with plants or with straw mulch. Number 3, store water in or under the soil. How do you store water under the soil? Have you ever heard of self-watering containers? Another name for them is sub-irrigated containers. That's how. The concept is obviously not new, but it's ingenious. I've linked my favorite brand of those types of containers. It's called Caja Planters, from my friends at The Growing Connection below in the show notes. I have also added a link to my program that I have created in collaboration with them. It's a school gardening program that uses their Caja planters. I will also add that link in the show notes. Those planters reduce the amount of watering that your volunteers need to do during summertime by 80%. They work very well. Okay, watering from below is the best way to irrigate an annual vegetable garden. But don't worry if your garden is not in containers and you can't get those types of self-watering containers, because there are other ways to water a garden from below. For example, Oya pots or Ola pots are these clay pots that you bury inside the soil. Their tip is out of the soil, and through their tip, they pour water inside of them. I will link a few of them in my Amazon finds in the show notes for you. You can also make DIY versions using just clay pots that you can find really cheaply in dollar stores. So just do a Google search and you'll find how to make Ola pots, the OLLA pots, from just clay pots from the dollar store. So these are pots that are clay and they're unglazed so that water actually seeps through them. So when the soil is dry, the water that's in the pot, and the pot is buried inside the soil, it seeps out to the soil through the clay. When it rains and your soil is wet, the water stays inside the pot. This is the most natural way of watering from below. I love it. It's ingenious. And both self-watering planters and Ola pots, they prevent overwatering, which is very important. And last but not least, my most favorite way to store water in the soil is building a Hugelkultur garden. That's Hugelkultur. If you haven't heard of it before, it's a fancy word for a super simple concept of piling wood and topping it up with soil. Or another way of saying it is burying wood in your garden. Now, that should be wood, not wood chips. Remember, I told you wood chips are not good for vegetable gardens. It should be wood, meaning logs and branches. Like, do you have a wooded, forested area or park close to your school? Take your students on a walk and gather together those fallen branches and then bury those branches inside your soil before you plant in it. Wood acts as the best natural sponge, holds on to all the water that you give it while you're in school in spring and all the spring rain, and then releases it back to the soil slowly and naturally during those dry, hot summer days. I've built a few Hugelkultur school gardens in my days, and they work like magic. Hugelkultur is not only water conserving, but it also is a long-term soil building for your soil, because those wood will very slowly decompose. And there are season extenders too, because inside of that soil gets really wet and hot, like inside of a compost would. And don't you ever forget the soil biodiversity that these types of gardens have. It's simply amazing. I might do a separate episode or a series of episodes about Hugelkultur. Let me know if you want me to do that in the comments below. For now, I'll link my guide, because I have a guide on this, on how to build a Hugelkultur school garden with your students. I'm going to link it in the show notes. Okay. Now, number 4, set up an easy and accessible watering system for your summer volunteers. No matter how water conserving your garden is, you still will need student volunteers to come at least once or twice a week to water your garden. Of course, those volunteers, because they're students, they are usually accompanied by their parents or some sort of adult, and that's good. But even for adults, you want to make their life easy. First of all, it's only fair to do that. And secondly, the easier you make their lives, the less frustrated and the more happy they will be, and the better job they will do. You want to have a hose and the key to the water tap, because usually the water taps in schools, they have a key. Not just anybody can walk to those taps and just open the water. You want the key to that and the hose to be easily available to volunteers so that they don't have to, call somebody like the caretakers or custodian or a building manager, knock on somebody's door, wait for the key to get to them, yada, yada. They should be able to get there, water, and leave. And they should be able to do that any day, at any time, even over the weekends or holidays. But at the same time, you want to make sure that your equipment is safe and secure. So you don't want people to just be able to easily walk away with all of your equipment. Now, for that, I have a best practice that I have developed, and I have a guide for it. I think the guide is called something like How to Build a School Garden Watering Chest. So go get that downloaded. It walks you through the best practice, what you need for it, and how to get it set up. Now, number 5, water correctly and train your volunteers to water correctly. And that depends on what type of setting you have. For example, if you have Caja Planters, sub-irrigated planters, Ola pots, obviously you need to let your volunteer know that they need to water inside the reservoirs and not, on top of the plants or on top of the soil. If you're not using any of those types of settings, then you have to water from the top. My favorite way to water from the top is drip irrigation systems. But since most of you won't have that or the means to purchase and put one together, we're not going to talk about that today. So you need to water with a hose in that case, and not just with any hose. Your hose should be a fabric, lightweight, preferably expandable hose with a multi-setting nozzle at the tip. I'll link an example of those that I have in my Amazon finds down in the show notes for you. Because dealing with heavy hoses in hot summer days is not easy, especially for younger or elderly people. Make it as easy as you can for your volunteers. It's the least you can do for them. And your hose needs to have a nozzle at the tip so that opening and shutting the water is easily done at the tip when they're doing the watering, and they don't have to run back and forth to the tap to open and close the water. Do not use watering cans. Please, 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 please don't use watering cans. Those require carrying heavy buckets of water multiple times back and forth from the tap to the water. It's frustrating, it's hard work, and it's not fair. Your volunteers will get tired and they will not water generously. And please do not use sprinklers, because sprinklers are the worst thing for vegetable gardens. The only thing they're good for is for lawns. They're wasteful, they're inefficient, and by spraying water on top of the leaves of your plants, they create fungal issues in cloudy days and leaf burnout in sunny days. So to recap, number 1, choose the right containers. Number 2, cover all surfaces of soil, preferably with plants. Number 3, store water in or under the soil. Number 4, set up an easy and accessible watering system for your volunteers. And number 5, water correctly. And you'll be not only reducing your watering chores significantly, you'd be making it easy for your volunteers, and that will guarantee your success. I hope you learned a thing or two in these 2 episodes about school garden summer maintenance. May your summer maintenance be smooth and easy, and you and your students return to the most amazing oasis of fruits and vegetables and herbs and seeds in fall. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week in another episode.